Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new installment of our department's research seminar. That's the Department for Theoretical Philosophy at the University of Bucharest. And the research seminar is organized jointly with CELFIS. That's the Center for Logic, Philosophy, and History of Science at the University of Bucharest, and ICUB. That's the Research Institute at the same university, and particularly the Humanities Division. We're delighted to be able to host this speaker series sponsored by WFISCGI, that's the local public funding agency for research, via a postdoctoral grant whose code is the following. PN-3 Roman P1-1.1 PD-2019-0535, and we're very grateful to our public sponsor. Tonight's speaker is Theodore Arabatzis. He's a professor at the National and Kapodistrian University in Athens, and he's also the acting president of the Society for the European Society for the History of Science. We're delighted to have Professor Arabatzis with us, and tonight he will be speaking to us about Contingency and Counterfactuals in History and Philosophy of Science. Theo, thanks so much for being here, and please take it away.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation and the kind introduction. Let me just share my PowerPoint. Just give me a sec. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes, it's quite clear.
It's quite clear. Okay, very good. Let me say at the beginning that this talk is based on joint work that I have done with my colleague Kostas Gavroglu, and we had a lot of fun thinking about contingency and counterfactuals, and I hope to be able to convey to you some of our fascination with this topic. Let me give you an outline of what I will be talking about in the next half an hour or so. In this paper, I would like to discuss the role of contingency and counterfactuals in two kinds of reconstructions of past scientific developments: historical reconstructions and rational reconstructions. I will first indicate the importance of contingency for historical reconstructions of past scientific practice. While the contingency of, say, the acceptance of a scientific theory prima facie licenses counterfactual histories leading to an alternative theory, the articulation of those histories, as I will suggest, is predicated on two conditions. First, the deliberate neglect of further contingencies along the counterfactual path to the alternative in question. Second, some guiding schema, causal or inferential, underpinning the unfolding of that path. I will argue that those conditions are not met in proper historical narratives precisely because those narratives have to incorporate contingent factors. Rather, those conditions can only be met in what I call quasi-historical accounts that are developed in the context of rational reconstructions of past scientific episodes, or sometimes pedagogical reconstructions of the emergence and acceptance of past scientific theories. Pedagogical reconstructions are a species of rational reconstructions. Let me now try to situate what I will be talking about within a larger framework. In earlier work, I have argued that a philosophically informed approach to the historiography of science can be historiographically fruitful. In a paper that I published a few years ago, I distinguished two ways of integrating history and philosophy of science. The first way is what I call historical philosophy of science, which addresses general epistemological and metaphysical issues about science in light of its historical development. And the second way is what I call philosophical history of science, which explores particular historical episodes or general historiographical issues while taking into account philosophical considerations about, say, the dynamics of scientific theories or the processes of conceptual change. So along similar lines, my main aim in this paper is to explore the historiographical implications of the debate on the contingency and inevitability of the process and the products of science. In particular, I would like to understand the ramifications of that debate for understanding science historically. I will outline an explanatory approach to past science based on the intellectual and material resources that were available to historical actors and on the constraints that delimited their available options. Those resources and constraints, I will suggest, merely delineate a space of possibilities within which the trajectories followed by historical actors can be explained on the basis of contingent factors, namely the biographical peculiarities and particular projects of inquiry. Historical accounts of past scientific developments have a descriptive and an explanatory function. They describe and explain various things, such as the rise and establishment of a new discipline, the emergence, consolidation, and development of a new theory, the planning, design, and carrying out of an experiment, the invention and legitimation of a new instrument and technique, and the conception and realization of a scientific project. These are some of the explananda of historical accounts of science. In all of these cases, the descriptive and explanatory functions of the corresponding historical accounts are inextricably tied. Both functions are accomplished via narratives, which select, order, and draw links between the pertinent primary and secondary sources. Furthermore, in many, if not most of those cases, what we are trying to explain, a so-called explanandum, is shown to be contingent. That is not the inevitable outcome of intellectual, social, or economic causes, but rather a result of the contingent decisions and actions of particular actors, individuals, or groups. Decisions and actions that could have been different. The case of the Galileo affair may illustrate this point, as several historians have argued that the infamous affair was not the outcome of an inevitable conflict between science and religion, but rather the result of Galileo's unfortunate misjudgment of the orders that he had received from the Catholic Church.
If I may just very quickly interrupt, Theo, just to make sure, we're still seeing the first slide. If this was intended, it's totally fine.
No, actually, I'm on the 7th slide now, so I don't know what the problem is. Let me, okay. What about now?
Yes, we can see the contingency of explananda now.
Yeah, well, I don't know what the problem is, but
you are not, are you projecting it on, can you start you're not on full screen with the slides?
No, I'm not on full screen, but if I'm on full screen, then what it shows is the first slide, my first slide, not the 7th slide. That's the problem. Is it visible? Is it still visible? Let me.
Yes.
Yes. No, it's visible. It's absolutely all right, but apparently something is not moving, so you have to be.
Yeah.
Now, yeah, we see the slide 7.
Okay. Let's see. What about now? Do you see another screen?
Yes.
Causation in history of science. Okay.
That's right. Thanks so much.
No problem. I just mentioned the word cause. That's a word that has given me a lot of trouble. and not just me. I mean, in the literature in general, the role of causation in understanding science historically has been a difficult issue. Some historians of science, such as Norton Wise and John Schuster, have expressed skepticism towards the importation of causal categories, such as, quote unquote, influence or shape, into historical accounts of past scientific developments. The main misgiving towards such notions is that they turn past scientists from active agents who consider and choose among a spectrum of possible beliefs and actions to cultural dopes. And this is Schuster's expression, who are swept away by overpowering historical currents. Rather than being mere puppets, historical actors and scientists in particular should be interpreted as having the capacity to act freely, to adopt beliefs, to challenge the status quo, to make decisions, and to pursue projects of inquiry. Of course, their freedom is not unconstrained. The historical context in which they are situated supplies the resources available to them and imposes a variety of constraints on their choices: material constraints, financial constraints, intellectual constraints, etc. Those resources and constraints delimit the options available to historical actors without, however, determining them completely. Room is often left for different, contingent choices, which are crucial for understanding the outcome of any given historical episode. If those choices were different, then the corresponding historical narrative would have been different, and the outcome could have been different too. Thus, the contingent aspects of past scientific developments are crucial for understanding them historically. Now, to the extent that they could have been different, those contingencies license one or more counterfactual possibilities. As I will suggest later, however, those possibilities cannot be articulated and traced in time beyond a certain point, which is usually very close to the contingency that in the first place licensed the counterfactual in question. Other historians of science are more favorably disposed towards causal or rather determinist history. A famous case is Paul Forman's analysis of the impact of Weimar culture on physicists and mathematicians. The ideological currents in the Weimar Republic, according to Forman, were so powerful that they swept physicists away from rationality and to the realm of mysticism, forcing them to betray their disciplinary standards. If Forman were right, then there would be little room for contingency in the explanatory repertoire of the historian of science. Rather, the emphasis should be on impersonal forces that leave little space for significant choices. Within this overpowering context, some choices and the contingent routes to be taken would still be available to the historical actors, but it is unclear if they would make any substantial difference. Now, the problem with accounts such as Forman's is that they downplay the plurality of scientists' responses to the historical quote-unquote forces that purportedly shape their behavior. In the case discussed by Forman, for instance, the physicists and mathematicians' adjustments to the ideological demands of their environment were not alike. Some physicists, for example, Pascual Jordan, actively pursued the neo-romantic ideologies in Weimar Germany, whereas others, such as Albert Einstein, strenuously opposed them. This indicates that we need a different historiographical approach of how culture and society and individual scientists are related, a model that leaves room for different, albeit not unconstrained choices, and thus allows for contingent factors to come into play.
This might be a good moment to switch to that slide. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Now you can see my next slide, explaining past science, right? Okay. Now, at every particular juncture, scientists have access to a range of resources and are subject to particular constraints. Those resources and constraints narrow down the choices available to them in their scientific pursuits. Within that narrowed down domain, scientists may follow different paths, depending on their personal traits, their aims and priorities. In this picture of explanation in history of science, there are two elements of contingency. First, the available resources and the operating constraints are historically variable and to that extent contingent. Second, the traits, aims, and priorities of historical actors may vary from actor to actor and introduce a further element of contingency in the development of scientific knowledge. One could still argue that the contingencies mentioned above do not affect substantially the content of scientific knowledge. They may direct the paths of scientific research by bringing to the forefront certain questions while pushing others to the margins, but they leave intact the outcome of that research, namely observations, experimental results, and scientific theories. Scientific theories, in particular, and I have moved to my next slide, are validated according to this view on the basis of time-tested epistemic values, such as predictive and explanatory power, consistency, coherence with background knowledge, etc. However, on more careful consideration, it turns out again that those values mark the boundaries of a space of possibilities, which encompasses or may encompass a plurality of theoretical viewpoints. Quite often in history of science, more than one theory was able to meet the epistemic desiderata in question with comparable success. And now an example comparison of the Ptolemaic and the Copernican systems. The study of the transition from the Ptolemaic to the Copernican astronomy has revealed that the choice between those systems was exceedingly complex and remained so for a long time. Both systems were empirically accurate, according to the standards of accuracy that were prevalent at the time, but only the Ptolemaic theory was compatible with accepted background knowledge, that is Aristotelian natural philosophy. The latter theory, the Copernican theory, on the other hand, was qualitatively simpler and more coherent, but made predictions that could not be verified, such as the existence of stellar parallax. What should one have done if faced with such a choice? I submit that this question admits no uniquely correct answer. Both choices would have been rationally permissible. Each choice would have been based on a different prioritization of different epistemic values. As a matter of fact, very few astronomers had adopted the Copernican system by the end of the 16th century. Until 1600, no more than 11 people had spoken out in favor of Copernicus' revision, as one historian of the scientific revolution put it. So I would argue that both the proponents and the opponents of the Copernican system responded rationally to a deeply uncertain epistemic situation. The particular choices made by particular historical actors within that epistemic space can only be explained on the basis of contingent factors. Now to my next slide. Thus, epistemic values function as constraints on the scientific process without completely determining its products. To put this point in familiar philosophical terms, epistemic values often underdetermine scientific development. They leave space for rational disagreement among scientists. The choices made by particular scientists can then be explained in light of contingent biographical or other factors. A historical narrative explaining the outcome of a scientific episode should delineate the space of possibilities that were available to the historical actors in light of the epistemic values that were prevalent in the community under consideration, and then complete the explanation by reconstructing the choices of those actors on the basis of various contingent factors. Now, what about counterfactuals, the historiographical alter ego of contingency? If the approach that I outlined to explanation in history of science is cogent, then the historiographical space for counterfactual history shrinks considerably. Within the space of possibilities available to past scientists, several alternative paths could have been possible. The one actually followed was the result of contingency in action. However, whereas one can reconstruct in some detail the actual path that was followed, the same cannot be said about the unfollowed alternatives. Those unfollowed paths would have involved a potentially infinite number of contingencies and are thus beyond the scope of historical knowledge. For this reason, I'm skeptical of the few attempts that have been made so far to construct accounts of the long-term consequences of fictitious alterations of the historical record. And what I have in mind here is a very impressive attempt, I have to say, by Peter Bowler to construct an imaginary history of what he calls a world without Darwin. Bowler published a book in 2013 with the provocative title, Darwin Deleted. And in that book, he offers an account which is immensely erudite and closely argued, but I find it ultimately unconvincing because it doesn't countenance the possibility of further contingencies after the quote-unquote deletion of Darwin. Nevertheless, and now we'll move to my next topic, despite the historiographical limitations of counterfactuals, they may have other useful functions. So I don't want to deny that counterfactuals can be useful, historical counterfactuals can be useful in some respects. One of those functions is manifested in rational reconstructions of the history of science. Which outline history of science as it should have been. While contingency is ineliminable in the historical explanation of past scientific practice, it has no place in rational reconstructions of that practice. In those reconstructions, such as most famously Imre Lakatos's, the rational narrative is a mere unfolding of a particular methodology of scientific research, exemplifying the various aspects of that methodology. The aim of those narratives is to trace an alternative, counterfactual path to the same outcome of a past scientific episode involving competing scientific theories, or what Lakatos calls research programs. The possibility of constructing such a path amounts to what Lakatos calls a rational explanation, or what I would call a post hoc justification of that outcome. Next slide. Lakatos's methodology. While a lot has been written about that methodology, there has been almost no discussion of the extent to which its application to history of science involved a heavy use of counterfactual reasoning. A brief glance at Lakatos's writings will make this apparent. His reliance on counterfactuals is evident in his discussion of two research programs, William Prout's in the 19th century and Niels Bohr's in the early 20th century. The former was based on the hypothesis, quote, that all atoms are compounds of hydrogen atoms, and thus atomic weights of all chemical elements must be expressible as whole numbers. According to Lakatos's rational reconstruction, Prout, quote, knew very well that anomalies abounded, but said that these arose because chemical substances, as they ordinarily occurred, were impure. end quote. To Lakatos' consternation, though, actual history was rather different. As he pointed out, quote, Proud denied the existence of any anomalies. So Lakatos first points out how Proud should have behaved, and then he has to admit that Proud behaved in a different way. Lakatos then proceeds with tracing the impact upon other chemists of the fictional writings of the fictional Proud. And this is what makes his reconstruction counterfactual and not a mere falsification of the historical record. Now let's move to Bohr's research program. That's my next slide. In his discussion of Bohr's program, Lakatos continues to take liberties with the historical record and engage in counterfactual reasoning. We read, for instance, that, quote, Bohr's plan was to work out first the theory of the hydrogen atom. Among the first steps in carrying out that plan, according to Lakatos, was, quote, taking the possible spin of the electron into account. In a footnote, however, Lakatos admits that, quote, this is a rational reconstruction. As a matter of fact, Bohr accepted this idea only in 1926. Again, the aim of tampering with the historical record, and I hope you see my next slide, is to support Lakatos' contention that Bohr's program was driven by its positive heuristic, namely the idea that atoms are analogous to planetary systems and not by experimental evidence. That contention, in turn, gives rise to the following counterfactual. I quote from Lakatos. The progress of science would hardly have been delayed had we lacked the laudable trials and errors of the ingenious Swiss school teacher, that is Johann Balmer, the speculative main line of science carried forward by the bold speculations of Planck, Rutherford, Einstein, and Bohr would have produced Balmer's results deductively as test statements of their theories without Balmer's so-called pioneering. To illustrate his philosophical account of the development of science as a series of competing research programs driven forward by their own internal dynamic, Lakatos thus resorted to counterfactuals. His rational reconstructions are narratives exemplifying the tenets of his methodology of scientific research programs, with no sensitivity whatsoever to the contingencies involved in what actually transpired in the corresponding historical episodes. In contrast to historical accounts, which, as I suggested earlier, need to incorporate various contingencies about the biographical and professional trajectories of past scientists, Lakatos' quote-unquote internal histories leave no room for contingencies but include counterfactual stories of how past scientists would and should have behaved if they had followed Lakatos' methodology. To put it another way, Lakatos puts himself in the shoes of a past scientist and shows how to radically improve, radically is Lakatos' word, how to radically improve upon his or her deeds. Even when Lakatos later protested in response to Kuhn's criticisms that he made no attempt to protect himself from real history, he retained a taste for counterfactual accounts. For instance, in a jointly authored paper with Elie Zahar on the Copernican revolution, he described that episode as, quote, narrowly internal. Its progressive part could have taken place at any time, given a Copernican genius, any time between Aristotle and Ptolemy, or in any year after, say, the 1175 translation of the Almagest into Latin, or for that matter, by an Arab astronomer in the 9th century. In this case, the important thing for Lakatos is that the outcome of the internal history, namely the supersession of Ptolemy's program by Copernicus, was the same with that of actual history. Thus, the latter was vindicated by Lakatos' methodology, and conversely, Lakatos' methodology was supported by it. Next slide. And that was precisely the reason for bringing up counterfactual possibilities, not to gain historical understanding, but to defend and articulate the implicit rationality of past scientific development and to show how the rationality in question was captured by Lakatos' methodology. In sum, Lakatos' reconstruction, most notably those of Prout's and Bohr's research programs, embody counterfactual elements, such as rearrangements of time order, the purpose of which is to suggest alternative paths to the results reached by actual science. Those paths would and should have been followed by if past scientists have adhered to Lakatos' methodology. Reading Lakatos as a counterfactualist provides a charitable interpretation of his tampering with the historical record. It makes clear that the aim of his enterprise, the main aim of his enterprise, was not to shed light on what actually happened, but rather to vindicate, on the basis of his methodology, the end results of often tortuous and contingent developments. Now, in the written version of the paper that I have written with Kostas, we have included a section on science education. And in that section, we argue that science textbooks often include counterfactual stories, and sometimes deliberately so. But I will leave all that for another occasion, and I will try to sum up and conclude. In the first section of this talk, I highlighted the ineliminable role of contingency in historical explanations of how scientific knowledge is created and validated, while in the remaining section, I focused on the central role of counterfactuals in rational reconstructions of scientific developments by philosophers of science, such as Lakatos. My purpose in contrasting the historiographical uses of contingency with the philosophical uses of counterfactuals was to show that contingency and counterfactuals cater to very different needs. Furthermore, I suggested that the articulation of counterfactuals has to be underpinned by a driving mechanism consisting of predictable causal processes or inferential connections and operating without interference from external contingencies. Such a mechanism cannot be found in actual history of science, but only in rational reconstructions, which thus enable counterfactual narratives to get off the ground. The conceptual connection notwithstanding, contingency and counterfactuals turn out to be odd bedfellows after all. That was it. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much for a wonderful talk, and I'm sure that everyone in the audience joins me using the applause button. And let's take this opportunity to queue in for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please make yourselves known either by raising your virtual hand or by signaling that in chat. And we already have a question from Dr. Doboge. Michna, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I have a question that goes along what you were saying about science education. And I was wondering if it's possible to add something more to the mix, namely to add myths. There is this edited volume by Ronald Numbers, published in several editions a while ago, where they are discussing about Newton's apple and other myths in the history of science. So how would you put those myths in the entire story? Is it about counterfactuals? Is it about causal explanations? It's just a nice story to convince people?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. Actually, in that book, Kostas and I have a chapter on the myth of the Michelson-Morley experiment. According to textbook authors, at least in the 70s and 80s, there was a genetic connection between the result of the Michelson-Morley result and the invention of relativity theory. But the actual story is much more complicated. There is a connection, but a more tenuous one. Now, there are in the written version, we distinguish different kinds of myths, as you call them. There are textbook authors that do not know the actual history, have not read historians of science, so they come up with very simplified accounts, simplified myths of what happened, of how or of what could have happened. Now, there are more sophisticated authors, textbook authors. Some of them are excellent physicists with a solid grasp of the history of their discipline. And those people know very well that history of science is very complex, that it includes or it contains several contingencies, and they deliberately simplify the historical record. They rearrange the historical record. They trace connections between elements that are not in the historical record, but they do that for pedagogical purposes, okay, to aid the students to understand the science that they are supposed to learn. And we have looked at physics textbooks that describe or discuss the emergence of relativity theory. And as I said, some of those textbooks falsify the historical record without even realizing that that they do that. But there are more sophisticated textbooks that do that deliberately, warning the reader that the development that they outline has very little to do with the actual historical development. So it's a complex issue. What we argue in the paper is that as long as we do not confuse textbook accounts with actual historical accounts, then it's fine to simplify a story or even rearrange a story, rearrange the elements of a story, provided, of course, that for reasons of intellectual honesty, that one warns the reader that this is not how things actually happen.
All right, thanks so much. And we have a new question from Professor Jalodani. Donna, please go ahead.
Actually, it's the same question, asked differently, because I like the idea that somehow pedagogical reconstructions are some form of rational reconstruction. And I was thinking maybe I should defend a bit Lakatos on this line as well. Because of course there are no clear-cut borders between textbooks and historical books. When we teach at different levels, and we oversimplify if we teach the Copernican revolution for the 5th grade. And then we have a different textbook for the 9th grade and another one for 1st year. And then when we teach PhD students, it's still some rational reconstruction, but it's a much more complex one. So one is tempted to take Lakatos' view here that this increased sophistication is guided by something. It's still guided by something. It's guided by an attempt to still maximize the rationality, but we take into account more and more contextual elements, more and more historical explanations as our textbook evolves from a very simplified one to a very, very complex one. Now, is there a point where this textbook or our attempt to teach events of the past cease to be a reconstruction of the past and becomes history, properly speaking, if you take it this way? we are here in a scenario of teaching, okay? You are teaching us, and you can go all the way down. So there is no borderline between textbooks and history books, let's say.
Thank you. This is an interesting question. It's I think it appeals to a typical skeptical argument, right? That there is a continuum, and there's no way to draw a line. But for me, it's enough that there are clear cases of textbook reconstructions that falsify the historical record, and then historical reconstructions that, as you say, I mean, I'm fully aware of that, and I agree with you that historical reconstructions, of course, simplify. They simplify, they rationalize, but they do that under constraints that are not there for textbook authors. So we simplify, we rationalize, but we have to take into account our sources, and textbook authors feel an obligation to do that, and that's not a problem. I mean, it's I don't mean that as an accusation. They have a different aim in mind. Their aim is to teach science and not to teach the history of science, and it's fine if for that purpose they simplify or even falsify history. But in actual historical accounts, I think that even for pedagogical purposes, a historian, when she or he teaches, say, the Copernican revolution, would not include in the account something that she or he knows that it's false, right? We would never do that, even if we try to tell the story to elementary students. But with textbook authors, things are different, and for good reason. Again, as I said, I mean, they're not historians. They operate under different constraints. So that would be my response. Not that in a sense there is a continuum. I wouldn't deny that, but the constraints operating are very different. And I think for a historian, it's absolutely essential not to falsify information that she or he knows that is accurate.
I meant good textbooks, where the point is not to falsify, but to eliminate what is too complicated for a particular level of understanding. The decision of what counts in Lakatos terms as internal history and external history. So if you are a good historian, but you still want to teach, you will say in respect to the Copernican revolution that certain aspects that are a bit too complicated, say from book 2 of the revolution onwards, are clear. You don't falsify them, you just pass them under the silence, and you try to reconstruct everything in terms of an internal history. While if you are teaching more advanced students, you take into account these details. So I didn't mean that you falsify, but you just don't focus on particular details. And in this case, being more and more historical means focusing on more and more historical details. Yeah. But if we take Lakatos' point, focusing on more and more historical details is also a philosophical choice. I'm focusing on more and more details with philosophical lenses on. So I make the decision, as a historian, to take into account some details and not take into account some other details in expounding what I understood about a particular phenomenon. And this is Lakatos claims, and I think he's right, that you make this on philosophical grounds. You will never take into account all possible historical details, all the facts that you ascribe to contingencies. And whether you take one into account or don't take another into account is a matter of philosophical choice, or a pedagogical choice, or the matter of, in this sense, I'm finding pedagogy being very relevant here, because every time when we're trying to understand something, we also try to teach and expound and so on. I don't see a clear-cut distinction between trying to explain to others what I understood of a historical phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the problem with Lakatos is that he used his methodology as a straitjacket in a way, or a Procrustean bed, and he tried to fit, you know, what actually happened within that Procrustean bed, and that's a problem. That's something that the historian would never do. And I'm not sure that, even though, you know, I'm very much in favor of integrating history and philosophy of science, I'm not sure that the factors that we decide to include in a narrative are determined by our philosophical perspective. Our philosophical perspective plays a role, no question about it. But I think the major factor in determining that choice is, you know, what it is that we are trying to explain. And when we include something in a narrative, then we need to make sure that the factor that we include is relevant to what we are trying to understand or to explain. So there is selection, but the selection is not guided by a preconceived philosophical schema, but by the task at hand, what it is that we are trying to understand. And we have to argue and demonstrate in a way that what is included in the narrative is explanatorily relevant, that it is essential to the narrative. It's not just you know, information that a mere add-on to a story that stands on its own without that information. But so I'm not against, you know, using philosophy or philosophical categories. For example, I mentioned in the talk the importance of epistemic values, appropriately historicized, of course. So this provides a philosophical framework for thinking about the past. But that's one thing. And another thing to use that framework to select you know, aspects of the past that fit the framework and reject all the rest.
May I just push this forward a bit? So, you know, think of the material culture change in history of science. Think of something very simple. We were discussing today about the dimensions of books, you know, whether a book was in folio or whether it was in octavo. Or there is a fantastic book about Galileo, about the context of publication of Galileo Sidereus Nuncius, which I forgot who is the author. It's called Sagredo's Idol, which discusses the choice of the editor of the book. And why is it relevant that editor is someone who had some problems with the church himself, and Galileo chose someone who was a problematic editor just because he wanted his book to get to the Frankfurt Fair in time, and that was the only author who could do that. This kind of historical details are motivated by explanatory questions, as you are saying, but no one asked them before the twist in history of science that led towards material culture. So they are philosophically motivated by our attempt to look at philosophy as practice and to look at history of science as a set of practices. So it's both ways. I'm not saying that you are not influenced, that you don't want to do a story that hangs together. I mean, in this I'm with Lakatos, you have to maximize the rationality. But some of the choices you make are influenced by this philosophical framework in which you are working, as, for example, looking at the material culture.
No, that's an excellent point, and I completely agree that looking at science from the perspective of practice brings to the fore new questions that that could and would be very, very fruitful to investigate historically. But that's one thing. In a sense, you are pointing to the heuristic value of philosophy of science, right? That a philosophical perspective may generate new knowledge. And that's a very important function. But that's one thing. And another thing to say that, whatever doesn't fit the framework is unimportant, and I don't want to know about it. And I think that Lakatos, in some of his moods at least, had such a, I don't know, a limited perspective.
All right, thanks so much. I have a nagging feeling that this conversation will go on. And hopefully we'll also see it in print at some point. So thanks so much for that. If there's some more questions, please don't hesitate to make yourselves known. And if not, I'm just going to abuse my privilege as a chair and ask a quick question of my own.
There's also one here in the room. But
Yes, of course. Please go ahead, Kristen.
Yeah, so I mean, I just wanted to kind of maybe continue the conversation that was previously going, and so if you had something you wanted to talk about, then that's fine. Yeah, I guess I kind of wanted to maybe raise Dana's point and Mitya's, but from a maybe putting it in a slightly different way, that kind of every historical inquiry seems to involve a certain amount of foregrounding and backgrounding. Mm-hmm. And like this depends on kind of what kind of research question you have, what kind of explanatory constraints you're setting on your research, what kinds of what kinds of particular evidence you're interested in, and so on. And we're going to kind of set the scope in very different ways depending on what it is we're trying to do. I guess what's not clear to me from your account is how we're just supposed to decide whether there are kind of better and worse ways of foregrounding and backgrounding, because I think it's certainly not the case that any kind of what we might call a rational construction, any kind of that is kind of acceptable. Any kind of explanation we try and give is going to be a good one, right? We want to be able to say that some of the ways that we kind of distort history are good, and some of the ways we distort history are going to be bad. And this might differ if we're in a pedagogical context. We probably don't want to distort history in ways that are going to kind of make it difficult for students to eventually accept the truth of the matter further down the line. There are sort of certain kinds of myths we tell students that make it really, really difficult for them to kind of then engage with history at a deeper level later. But there are other kind of myths that seem to be okay, that do kind of make it, that do kind of pave the way for students to pick up things. Mm-hmm. When we're thinking more about kind of, doing kind of academic history, there are going to be different kind of myths again. And we know the philosophers of science are really bad at using kind of toy cases and stuff just to reinforce philosophical values, epistemic values that they think are good ones, when in fact, and it makes it really difficult further down the line to kind of correct those myths and things like that. So I guess I'm curious about whether you have any thoughts about how we are supposed to choose between good and bad ways of distorting history like that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let me put it in slightly different terms. It's not so much a question of distorting, but as a question of how fruitful it is to use a certain philosophical framework, right? Because I think that historians have their own ways of appraising historical narratives, right? So you write an article, you write a book, and then there are many people who are willing to point out its deficiencies to you. You haven't included in your account a relevant fact, or you have disregarded, I don't know, a manuscript that is relevant to your story, blah, blah, blah. So the evaluation of historical narratives is made on a case-by-case basis. Of course, there are certain desiderata, right? I mean, one should try to do justice to the sources. One should not neglect sources or printed or unpublished sources that are relevant to what he or she is trying to understand, and so on and so forth. Now, so there are ways, there are criteria for evaluating a historical account. And then the question as regards the comparative evaluation of philosophical perspectives, because I think that's what you were trying to get at, has to do, in my view, with the quality of narratives that they enable. So, for example, think of what Dana said before about thinking of science not as a body of knowledge, but as a practice, as an activity, both an intellectual and a practical activity. That's a different perspective that generates new questions, that widens the potentially relevant sources to understanding science, and so on and so forth. So that perspective makes possible richer narratives, as opposed to a more narrow perspective, such as Lakatos's, who sees science as just a competition among, I don't know, evolving theories or research programs. I don't know if I've answered your question, but so it's not a question of, in my view, it's not a question of falsifying or distorting history and then asking, whether it is legitimate to do that. I would say that it's never legitimate to distort history once you know that, you are falsifying the historical record. You shouldn't do that. It's one thing, to simplify a story, but another thing, to deliberately ignore facts just to, make your philosophical accounts sound more plausible or more convincing. So it's never okay to falsify historical information, but if we see philosophies of science as historiographical perspectives, then we evaluate different philosophies of science on the basis of the quality of the historical narratives that they enable, I would say.
Thank you.
I wonder, Christian, if you have a follow-up, by all means, go ahead. Okay. Can I then just very quickly follow up myself and pick on the very last thing you said? I believe you said that it's never okay to omit facts, to mend specifications of facts in the interest of a good narrative. And I wondered about that. So suppose we were tempted to push a line similar to that proposed by Catherine Elgin and say that there are some very felicitous falsehoods. Well, why shouldn't we also consider the felicitous character of some nice narratives in the history of science? And those might do the trick in some introductory textbooks, but they might also do the trick in terms of training more advanced students. And somebody might say, look, the benefit reaped by these students simply outweighs the obvious cost of ignoring some known truths. So I wonder if this kind of trade-off between beneficial consequences and turning a blind eye at some very minute facts is, I wonder if you need to take a stance on this, or if the trade-off could simply be context sensitive.
Thank you. I would reply that that depends on your purpose. There are, I would definitely agree that there are felicitous falsehoods, but that depends on your purpose. So if for example, a great deal of what Lakatos, for example, was doing is fine with me. So he tried to articulate a methodology and to argue against earlier methodologies such as Popper's, and he wanted to show that if scientists in the past had been aware and had followed Lakatos's methodology, then they would have made choices that we now consider, progressive and important and so on and so forth. Okay, that's one thing, and I think it's fine to do that. So it's fine to come up with a simplified or even a fictitious, totally fictitious account of what would have happened if scientists in the past had followed, Lakatos's or someone else's methodology. That's fine with me. What the problem I have is, conflating this enterprise with actual history of science, where we are trying to understand what actually happened. And there, I mean, it's fine. Of course, it's fine to omit all kinds of facts. Some years ago, a very famous historian of science, Charles Gillespie, said once that the main asset of a historian is his ignorance, because if you know everything, then you cannot write anything, right? If you know all the facts, then it's impossible to write anything. So in a way, limited knowledge is an asset, because it enables you, to start a project. Otherwise, you would feel overwhelmed by the wealth of historical information that is available. So in that sense, I would agree, but at the same time, I think that it's not okay. It's never okay for a historian who knows that a fact is relevant to the story that she or he is trying to tell, to omit that fact. Okay, so it's a question of relevance, a question of importance that involves judgment, of course. It's not written in stone, what's important and what's not. So the historian has to make that judgment. But and she or he, will include facts depending on the judgments that she or he makes. But that's one thing, and another thing to know that something is the case, and know that something may have some relevance to the story that she or he is trying to tell, and deliberately ignore that just to make the argument sound more convincing, more clear cut, and so on.
Let me put it another way, and I promise this is that I'll stop after this. So suppose that you write a fantastic book, okay, and then your publisher tells you, look, Theo, this is terrific, but you need to cut 70 pages and you need to get a better story, okay? Were you to do what your publisher urges you to do, would you be in breach of your professional duty?
Not necessarily, no. Provided that what I would do in such a case, or well, I mean, there are several options. One option is to look for another publisher. Yeah. If you stay with your publisher, then what I would try to do is to simplify, but not to falsify, right? I mean, to tell a story in an abridged form, but not to omit facts that I think are important. Okay, because it's one thing to simplify. I mean, as Dana said, we have to simplify all the time. We have to take into account our audience. We teach to undergraduates, we teach graduate students. Sometimes, I go to high schools and tell them stories about science. I take into account, the particularities of each audience, the knowledge that they may have, the skills that they have, the technical background that they have or do not have, and so on and so forth. And I tailor the story that I tell to the particular audience. Okay, so in that sense, or in a similar sense, I would try to do something, along these lines to simplify perhaps a story, to make it more accessible to a wider audience, if that's what what the publisher wants, but at the same time not distort it in ways that I don't think acceptable. I mean, I know that this sounds vague, but this has to be judged on a case-by-case basis, and we have to make judgments of that kind all the time. We do not have the luxury to, I don't know, write 1,000 page books, right? We have to condense information, we have to simplify things. There's no way around this problem, but we do it very carefully. When we do that, we are treading on thin ice, so to speak, and we need to be very careful.
All right, thank you so much. If there are some final questions or comments, this is the time. All right, please join me once again in thanking Professor Arabatzis. This has been quite enlightening and wonderful talk. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. These were really thoughtful and insightful questions, and I promise to think about them more.
And next time you come to Bucharest in person.
I would love that. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, all, and have a good night.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having
Bye.
me. Bye-bye.